Greetings, dear seekers, dear companions on the path of inner mastery. There is a quiet paradox in life, so subtle that most people carry it for years without ever realizing it. There are people who are not lacking in intelligence, not lacking in opportunity, not lacking in potential, and yet their lives remain small. Their actions remain hesitant. Their presence remains unnoticed, not because they are weak, but because they believe they are. And that is where every limitation begins. You see, most people grow up with an invisible assumption that strength is something to be built, that confidence is something to be practiced, that power is something to be proven. So they try to change their behavior. They try to speak more confidently. They try to act more decisively. But beneath all of that, they still see themselves as someone who is not enough. And so everything they build feels forced, temporary, fragile. Because the truth is this: you do not act based on your potential. You act based on your identity, which means if deep down you see yourself as someone who might be rejected, you will hesitate. If you see yourself as someone who is not ready, you will delay. If you see yourself as someone who is weak, you will seek permission instead of making decisions. No one is forcing you into that position. No circumstance is trapping you there. It is the way you see yourself, quietly shaping everything you do. And the most dangerous part is it feels natural, so natural that you begin to believe this is just who I am. But it isn't. You are not weak. You are simply repeating a version of yourself that you have practiced for too long, a version built from moments of rejection, of doubt, of hesitation. And over time, you didn't just experience those moments, you became identified with them. But pause for a moment and look carefully. Are you truly weak? Or are you seeing yourself through an outdated lens? Are you truly incapable? Or have you simply never allowed yourself to act as someone who is? Because in this world, nothing limits you more than the identity you carry. And when you believe you are weak, you will unconsciously build a life that proves it. But the moment that belief shifts, everything begins to move. Not because you forced it, not because you tried harder, but because you are no longer acting against yourself. Because the world does not respond to your true potential. It responds to who you believe you are. And the only question that truly matters is not, what should I do to become stronger? But rather, who do I believe I am in the moments that matter most? Part 1, you are not weak, you are rehearsing a role. There is something you must see before anything in your life can truly change. Weakness is rarely what it appears to be. It is not something you are born with. It is not something fixed inside you. It is not a permanent condition. It is a pattern of thoughts, a pattern of reactions, a pattern of decisions repeated so many times that it begins to feel like identity. And that is where the illusion begins. Because the moment a pattern feels familiar, you stop questioning it. You stop seeing it as something you do, and you start seeing it as something you are. I'm just not confident. I'm not that type of person. I tend to overthink. Listen closely to those words. They don't describe behavior. They define identity. And once something becomes identity, you no longer resist it. You protect it. This is why most people never escape what they call weakness. Not because they lack strength, but because they have unknowingly built a relationship with the version of themselves that feels weak. They repeat it. They reinforce it. They return to it, even when opportunities to act differently appear. Think about this carefully. There are moments in your life when you could have acted with certainty. You could have spoken clearly. You could have moved forward without hesitation. But something stopped you. Not reality, not lack of ability, but a quiet voice, one that did not shout, but simply whispered, "That's not who you are." And you listened, not because it was true, but because it was familiar. That is how identity operates. It does not force you. It filters you. Every situation you encounter passes through the lens of who you believe you are, and that lens decides before you even become aware of it. Two people stand in the same moment. One hesitates, the other acts. One overthinks, the other decides. One waits for the right time, the other creates it. And from the outside, it looks like confidence versus insecurity. But from the inside, it is something much deeper. It is identity versus identity. Because the one who acts is not necessarily more capable. They simply do not see themselves as someone who hesitates. And that single difference changes everything. This is what most people misunderstand. They believe weakness is something to fix, something to fight, something to overcome through effort. So they try harder, they push themselves, they force new behaviors, they attempt to act differently. But each time they do, there is resistance, a quiet tension, because their actions are trying to move in one direction while their identity is pulling them back in another. And an identity always wins, not because it is stronger in power, but because it is deeper in position. It sits beneath your actions, beneath your decisions, beneath your awareness. It is the script, and you are simply performing it. This is why change feels so difficult, not because change itself is hard, but because you are trying to change the performance without changing the role. Imagine an actor who has played the same character for years, same posture, same tone, same reactions, and one day they're told to act differently, to be bold, to be decisive, to be fearless. They can try, they can mimic the behavior, but if deep inside they still see themselves as the old character, every movement will feel unnatural, every action will feel forced, and sooner or later they will return to what feels like themselves. This is exactly what happens in your life. You are not struggling with weakness. You are returning to a version of yourself that you have rehearsed for too long, a version that feels safe because it is known, even if it limits you, even if it keeps you small, even if it costs you opportunities, respect, and growth, because familiarity is more powerful than possibility when identity is involved. So understand this clearly. You are not weak. You are consistent in how you see yourself, consistent in how you respond, consistent in the role you continue to play, even when a different version of you is available. And the moment you truly see that, something shifts. You stop asking, how do I become stronger? And you start asking something far more dangerous. Why am I still choosing to be this version of myself? Part 2, identity quietly controls every decision you make. There is a layer beneath your thoughts, beneath your emotions, beneath even your conscious choices. A layer so subtle that most people live their entire lives without ever seeing it, and yet it decides everything. That layer is identity. Not the identity you show the world, not the one written in your bio or reflected in your achievements, but the one you carry silently within. The one that answers a question you rarely ask directly, who am I, when it matters? Because in the moments that define your life, you do not stop to think. You do not analyze deeply. You do not weigh every possibility. You act. And what you act from is not logic. It is identity. This is why two people can stand in the exact same situation and live completely different realities. The same opportunity appears. One sees risk, the other sees possibility. One hesitates, the other moves. One overthinks, the other decides. From the outside, it looks like confidence versus fear, but internally it is something much deeper. It is interpretation, because reality itself is neutral. It does not tell you what to do. It does not define your limits. It does not assign your value. You do, through the lens of who you believe you are. And that lens is always active. You don't turn it on. You don't control it consciously. It filters everything automatically. Every situation you enter is interpreted through identity. Every decision you face is shaped by identity. Every action you take is aligned with identity. This is why you can know what to do and still not do it, because knowledge does not override identity. You can understand confidence and still hesitate. You can learn discipline and still delay. You can study communication and still remain silent, not because you lack ability, but because your identity does not support that behavior. And identity always protects itself. If you see yourself as someone who hesitates, you will find reasons to wait. If you see yourself as someone who needs approval, you will look for validation. If you see yourself as someone uncertain, you will delay decisions, not consciously, but consistently, because your mind is not designed to make you powerful. It is designed to make you consistent with who you believe you are. That is why, even when you try to change, something pulls you back. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but subtly, like a current beneath the surface, guiding you back to what feels familiar. You call it overthinking, you call it fear, you call it lack of discipline, but underneath all of that is identity, maintaining itself. This is also why the world seems to respond differently to different people, not because they are treated differently at random, but because they present themselves differently. at the deepest level. Before you speak, your identity has already spoken. Before you act, your presence has already signaled something. And people respond not just to your words, but to what is behind them. This is why two people can say the same thing and receive completely different reactions. One is ignored, the other is respected. One is questioned, the other is trusted. Not because of the words, but because of the identity that those words are coming from. People feel certainty. They feel hesitation. They feel instability or groundedness, even if they cannot explain it, because identity is expressed through presence, through posture, through tone, through timing, through stillness, and all of that comes from how you see yourself. So when you say, I'm just not confident, you are not describing a problem. You are reinforcing a structure that will shape how you walk into a room, how you speak in a conversation, how you respond under pressure, how you decide when it matters. And over time, that structure becomes your reality. Not because reality changed, but because your interaction with it did. This is the part most people never realize. They try to change their life by changing what they do. They adjust behavior. They learn techniques. They practice habits. But beneath all of that, the lens remains the same. And so eventually, everything returns to what it was, because behavior cannot sustain itself against identity. This is why real change does not begin with action. It begins with recognition. Seeing clearly that you are not reacting to reality, you are reacting to who you believe you are within it. And once you see that, you stop asking, what should I do differently? And you start asking something far more precise. What version of myself is making this decision right now? Part 3. The more you try to become strong, the more you reinforce weakness. There is a mistake so common, so deeply ingrained, that almost everyone makes it without realizing. When people feel weak, they try to become strong. They push themselves. They force discipline. They try to act confident. They try to think positively. And for a moment, it works. They feel different. They act differently. They convince themselves that change is happening. But then, slowly, something begins to pull them back. They hesitate again. They doubt again. They fall into the same patterns they thought they had escaped. And the conclusion they reach is always the same. I'm not consistent. I need more discipline. I need to try harder. But that is not the problem. The problem is they are trying to build strength on top of an identity that still believes it is weak. And that creates conflict. Because every time you try to become strong, you are unconsciously confirming one thing, that I am not strong yet. And that belief does not disappear just because you act differently for a while. It stays, it watches, and eventually it pulls you back into alignment with itself. This is why effort alone never creates lasting change, because effort operates at the level of behavior, while identity operates at the level of being, and behavior cannot outrun identity. You can force yourself to speak with confidence, but if you still see yourself as someone uncertain, your tone will betray you, your timing will hesitate, your presence will feel unstable. You can push yourself to take action, but if you still believe you are someone who is not ready, you will delay at the last moment. You will second-guess your decisions. You will look for reasons to step back, not because you are weak, but because your actions are trying to move in a direction your identity does not support. And identity always wins, not immediately, but inevitably. This is the hidden tension that most people live with. On the surface, they are trying to improve, but underneath, they are still holding on to the same definition of themselves. And so every action feels like resistance, like pushing against something invisible, like trying to become someone they don't truly believe they are. That is why it feels exhausting. That is why it feels unnatural. That is why it never lasts. Because you are not aligned. You are divided. One part of you is trying to move forward. The other part is pulling you back to what feels familiar. And familiarity is more powerful than effort. So the more you try to become strong while still identifying as weak, the more you reinforce the very thing you are trying to escape. This is the paradox. The harder you try, the deeper you stay, because every attempt is built on the same assumption: I am not enough yet. And as long as that assumption remains, everything you build will collapse back into it. This is why some people do not need to force confidence. They do not need to remind themselves to act. They do not need to push through resistance in the same way. because they are not trying to become someone else. They are simply acting from who they already believe they are. That difference is everything. When your identity is aligned, action feels natural. Not easy, but natural. You do not need to convince yourself. You do not need to negotiate with yourself. You do not need to fight internal resistance at every step because there is no conflict. There is only expression. This is why you don't become confident by acting confident. You act confident when you see yourself as someone who is. You don't become disciplined by forcing habits. You become disciplined when discipline is part of your identity. And once that shift happens, everything changes. Not because you suddenly gained more ability, but because you removed the resistance that was holding you back. So understand this clearly. The problem is not that you are weak. The problem is that you are trying to fix weakness without questioning the identity that created it. You are trying to upgrade behavior while keeping the same self-definition, and that will never work because behavior follows identity, always. So the real shift is not, how do I try harder? How do I stay consistent? How do I force better habits? The real shift is, what would happen if I stopped seeing myself as someone who is weak completely? Because the moment that identity dissolves, there is nothing left to fix. Only a different way of being, waiting to be expressed. Part 4, real strength is not force, it is stability. There is a level of strength that most people misunderstand completely. They think strength means not feeling anything, not being affected, not reacting at all. They imagine strength as something rigid, cold, unshaken because nothing touches it. But that is not strength, that is avoidance. Real strength is something far more subtle and far more powerful. It is not the absence of emotion. It is not the absence of pressure. It is the absence of instability. Because the truth is, life will always test you. There will always be pressure. There will always be opinions. There will always be moments that try to pull you out of yourself. You will be praised. You will be criticized. You will be accepted and rejected. And if your internal state depends on those things, you will never be stable. You will rise when people approve of you. You will fall when they don't. You will feel strong when things go your way. You will feel weak when they don't. And in that cycle, you are not in control. You're being controlled by outcomes, controlled by reactions, controlled by everything outside of you. This is where most people live, constantly adjusting, constantly reacting, constantly shifting based on what happens around them. And because of that, they never build real strength, only temporary states. Because anything that depends on the outside can be taken away by the outside. But there's another level, a deeper level, where your internal state is no longer tied to what happens externally. You still feel, you still experience, you still move through life fully, but you are not shaken, not easily, not completely, not in a way that changes who you are. This is what it means to be truly strong, not untouchable, but unshaken, because strength is not about resisting the world. It is about not being moved by it unnecessarily. Think about this carefully. When someone criticizes you, do you react instantly? Do you feel the need to defend, to explain, to prove something? Or can you remain still? When something doesn't go your way, do you collapse internally? Do you question yourself? Do you lose clarity? Or do you stay grounded? Because in those moments, your identity is revealed, not in what you say, not in what you claim, but in how stable you remain when something tries to move you. This is why instability is the real weakness. Not lack of skill, not lack of knowledge, but the inability to hold your state. Because the moment your state is unstable, everything else begins to break. Your decisions become unclear, your actions become reactive, your words become uncontrolled. You say things you regret, you act in ways that weaken you, you give away energy to things that do not deserve it, and slowly you lose control. Not because you are incapable, but because you are being pulled by emotion, pulled by pressure, pulled by external influence. But when your state is stable, something entirely different happens. You slow down, not physically, but internally. You create space between what happens and how you respond. And in that space, you regain control. You observe first, you choose next, you act last. That sequence changes everything because now you are no longer reacting. You are deciding. And that is where power begins, not in speed, not in force, but in control. This is why truly strong people often appear calm. They do not rush to respond. They do not rush to speak. They do not rush to react. Not because they are passive, but because they are not being pulled. They are grounded. And that groundedness creates a different presence. A presence that does not need to prove itself, a presence that does not need to explain itself, a presence that others can feel. This is also why people will begin to respect you without you asking for it, because they sense something. They sense that you are not easily moved, not easily influenced, not easily shaken. And that creates weight, a kind of quiet authority that does not come from what you say, but from what you hold within. So understand this clearly. Real strength is not about doing more. It is not about pushing harder. It is not about forcing yourself forward. It is about becoming stable, stable in how you see yourself, stable in how you respond, stable in who you are, regardless of what happens. Because the moment you are no longer shaken, you are no longer controlled. And the moment you are no longer controlled, you become free. Free to act, free to decide, free to move from clarity instead of reaction. And that is where real power begins. Part 5, silence, the weapon of those who know who they are. There comes a point in the process of understanding yourself where something begins to change, not on the surface, not in what you show others, but in how you move internally. You begin to speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer feel the need to say everything. And this is where most people misunderstand. They think silence is weakness. They think speaking less means lacking confidence. They think not explaining means you have something to hide. But the truth is, silence is not the absence of power. It is the result of it. Because the more certain you are about who you are, the less you feel the need to prove it. Think about this carefully. Why do people over-explain? Why do they justify every decision, clarify every intention, defend every action? It is not because they are expressive. It is because they are uncertain about how they are perceived, uncertain about whether they will be understood, uncertain about whether they are enough. And that uncertainty seeks validation. So they speak more, they add more detail, they try to remove every possible doubt. But in doing so, they reveal the very thing they are trying to hide. Because over-explaining is not communication. It is a signal that something inside is not settled. Now contrast that with someone who is clear, someone who knows who they are. They do not rush to explain. They do not feel pressure to justify. They do not try to control how others see them. They say what is necessary, and then they stop. And that stop is where power lives, because silence creates weight. When you speak less, each word matters more. When you do not explain everything, people pay closer attention. When you do not rush to respond, others begin to adjust to your pace. Not consciously, but naturally. Because silence shifts the dynamic. It removes you from reaction and places you in control. This is why the strongest presence in a room is often the quietest one. Not because they are trying to dominate, but because they are not being pulled. They are not reacting to every comment, not responding to every opinion, not engaging with everything that appears. They choose. They choose what deserves their attention. They choose what deserves their words. They choose what deserves their energy. And that choice creates authority, because authority is not about speaking more. It is about knowing when not to. Most people give their energy away constantly. They respond to everything. They explain to everyone. They try to be understood in every situation. And over time, that drains them. It weakens their presence. It scatters their focus. It dilutes their impact. Because every word is energy. Every reaction is energy. Every explanation is energy. And if you give that energy away without control, you lose power. Not instantly, but gradually, silently, until you no longer feel centered. But when you begin to control that, everything changes. You stop reacting automatically. You stop filling every silence. You stop feeling the need to respond immediately. And at first, this feels uncomfortable because you are used to speaking, used to explaining, used to making sure everything is clear. So when you stop, there is tension, a feeling that you should say more, that you should clarify further, that you should not leave things unresolved. But that feeling is not truth. It is habit. It is the echo of your old identity, the one that needed validation, the one that needed approval, the one that needed to be understood. And the moment you sit in that silence without reacting, something begins to break. You begin to see that not everything requires a response. Not everything requires explanation. Not everything deserves your energy. And in that realization, you gain control because now you are no longer acting automatically. You are choosing when to speak, choosing when to remain silent, choosing when something matters and when it does not. And that choice is what creates real power, because power is not an expression, it is in restraint. It is in knowing that your presence alone is enough. So understand this clearly. Silence is not about saying nothing. It is about removing everything unnecessary so that what remains is strong, clear, and undeniable. Because when you no longer feel the need to prove yourself, you stop giving your power away. And when you stop giving your power away, you begin to hold it quietly, steadily, completely. And that is when everything changes. Not because you said more, but because you no longer needed to. Part 6, when your inner state stabilizes, reality begins to reorganize. At the deepest level, everything you've explored so far leads to one point. Not action, not behavior, not strategy, but state. Your inner state. Because once your inner state changes, your entire experience of reality begins to change with it. Not instantly, not magically, but inevitably. Most people spend their lives trying to fix the outside. They look for better opportunities, better environments, better timing, better conditions. They believe that if the world changes, their life will improve. But what they fail to see is this: even if the outside changes, they bring the same identity with them, the same doubts, the same fears, the same patterns. And so, different situation, same experience, because the source was never external, it was internal. This is why real transformation does not begin with what you do. It begins with how you are. Your inner state is constantly shaping what you notice, what you ignore, what you interpret as opportunity or as threat. Two people walk into the same environment. One sees possibility, the other sees risk. One moves forward, the other holds back. Not because the situation is different, but because their inner state is different. And that difference creates a completely different reality, because perception drives behavior. Behavior drives results, and results shape reality. This is the chain. And at the beginning of that chain is your state. If your inner state is unstable, everything feels uncertain. You overthink, you hesitate, you react emotionally, and those reactions create outcomes. Outcomes that reinforce the belief, I'm not ready, I'm not capable, this is difficult. And so the cycle continues. But when your inner state becomes stable, something shifts. You begin to see more clearly. Not because the world changed, but because you are no longer distorting it. You respond with intention instead of impulse. You act with clarity instead of hesitation. And those actions create different outcomes. Outcomes that reinforce a new belief. I can handle this. I am grounded. I am in control. And slowly, your reality begins to reorganize. Not because you forced it, but because your interaction with it changed. This is what most people misunderstand. They think mindset is abstract, vague, unrealistic, but it is not. It is practical. Because every external result is a reflection of internal patterns. When your state is unstable, you tolerate things you shouldn't. You stay in environments that drain you. You accept behaviors that weaken you. You engage in patterns that limit you, not because you choose to, but because it matches your state. But when your state changes, your standards change. You begin to reject what no longer aligns. You stop engaging with what pulls you down. You stop responding in ways that weaken you. And without forcing anything, your environment begins to shift. The people around you change. The opportunities you notice change. The situations you accept change. Not because the world suddenly became different, but because you did. Your decisions filter your reality. Your standards shape your environment. Your identity defines what you allow. And all of that comes from your inner state. This is why you do not need to control everything. You do not need to chase every opportunity. You do not need to force your life into shape. You need to stabilize yourself. Because when your state is stable, your actions become consistent. When your actions are consistent, your results become predictable. And when your results are predictable, your reality begins to align. Not perfectly, but progressively. Until one day, you look around and things feel different. Not because everything changed, but because you did. This is the quiet transformation. The one that does not require constant effort. The one that does not rely on motivation. The one that happens when you are no longer trying to become someone else, but are finally acting from a stable version of yourself. So understand this clearly. You are not fighting the world. You are interacting with it through the version of yourself you believe to be true. And the moment that version changes, everything else begins to follow, not by force, but by alignment. Because reality does not resist you, it reflects you. And when your inner state stabilizes, your reality has no choice but to reorganize around it. Heshard conclusion, you were never weak. You were just looking at yourself the wrong way. When you step back and observe everything clearly, a simple truth begins to reveal itself. You were never truly weak, not in the way you believed. You were not limited by your ability. You were not held back by reality. You were not lacking something essential. What held you in place was something far more subtle. The version of yourself you chose to believe was real. Every hesitation, every moment of doubt, every time you held yourself back was not caused by the world. It was caused by the way you saw yourself within it. Not consciously, not intentionally, but consistently. And that consistency became your life. Because over time, you stopped questioning it. You stopped seeing it as a pattern and you started calling it who I am. But now you see differently. You begin to realize you were never acting from your potential. You were acting from your identity. And that identity was never fixed. It was built from past experiences, built from repeated thoughts, built from moments that you unknowingly turned into definitions. But anything that is built can be rebuilt, not by force, not by pretending, not by trying to become someone else, but by choosing a different way of seeing yourself. Because the shift was never about doing more, it was about seeing differently. The moment you stop asking, what do I need to fix, and start asking, who am I choosing to be right now, everything changes. You no longer chase confidence, you move from it. You no longer try to act strong, you express it. You no longer fight your old patterns, you outgrow them. Not because you force them away, but because they no longer match who you believe you are. And from that place, something powerful happens. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop asking for permission. You stop explaining your existence to the world because you are no longer unsure. And that certainty, even if it is quiet, even if it is unseen, begins to shape everything around you. Your decisions become clearer. Your actions become cleaner. Your presence becomes heavier, not loud, but undeniable. And slowly, without force, without struggle, your life begins to reorganize. Not perfectly, but precisely because you are no longer reacting to reality. You are shaping your experience of it through who you choose to be. So understand this clearly. You do not need to wait to become strong. You do not need proof. You do not need validation. You do not need permission. You need a decision about identity, because the version of you that you believe in is already shaping your future in every action, in every hesitation, in every moment that matters. So the real question is not, how do I change my life? The real question is, who are you when no one is watching? And are you ready to stop being someone you no longer need to be?